She walked into the bar for just a few minutes, but the cadets decided to make her a target for humiliation. No one could have imagined how it would end. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us where you're watching from. More real stories are coming soon. The rain had finally stopped over the small coastal town, leaving the streets slick with reflection. Neon lights from the old marina blinked through the mist like dying stars, and a faint smell of salt and diesel drifted inland with the wind. On a narrow corner overlooking the water stood a place called the 7 Knots, a weathered bar whose sign buzzed in tired shades of blue and gold. It was the kind of place where time slowed down, where fishermen came to forget the sea and soldiers came to remember who they used to be. Inside, the light was low and amber, softened by years of cigarette smoke that clung to the walls no matter how many times they'd been scrubbed. The air carried a steady hum of murmured talk, clinking glasses, and the faint rasp of a country song playing from an old jukebox in the corner. Behind the bar moved Lena, a stout woman in her late 50s with a calm face that had seen more bar fights than she could count. She worked like someone who had turned chaos into routine swift, unbothered, knowing exactly when to pour another drink or when to cut someone off with a single look. When Ronda Rousey stepped through the door, the hinges groaned like they hadn't been oiled in months. She paused at the threshold, taking in the familiar layout, the murmur of voices, the haze of fried food and beer. She wasn't dressed to stand out: dark jeans, a gray hoodie, hair tied back, sneakers still damp from the rain. But she didn't need to stand out. Even if no one recognized her face right away, something in the way she carried herself balanced, aware, grounded made space for her, without her asking. She nodded at Lena, who met her gaze with the faintest smirk. "Tea?" The bar owner asked, already reaching for the kettle. "And maybe that turkey sandwich you keep pretending you don't like?" Rhonda allowed herself a small smile. "You know me too well." She took her usual seat in the far corner near the window, where she could watch both the door and the mirror behind the bar. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. After years of fights, training, and endless travel, her body still moved like an instrument tuned to danger. Even here, in this quiet fishing town, she couldn't stop scanning the room, counting exits, noting the weight of the people who moved near her. There were a few older fishermen sitting near the jukebox, their faces carved by sun and salt. 2 long-haul truckers played pool near the back, exchanging jokes that nobody else found funny. It was a Friday night, rhythm predictable, easy, human. And for the first time in days, she felt herself beginning to relax. The tea arrived steaming in a chipped white mug. Lena placed it gently on the table, leaning in just enough to lower her voice. "You look tired," she said. "Rough day?" Rhonda shrugged. "Seminar with a group of veterans. Good people, but heavy stories. You start to feel the weight after a while." Lena nodded, understanding. She'd hosted more than a few ex-military regulars in her bar. Some came for the noise, others for the silence. "You're safe here," she said simply, before turning to serve another customer. The words were meant kindly, though Rhonda didn't quite believe in safe anymore. For the next half hour, the night drifted without interruption. She ate slowly, savoring the rare calm. Her phone buzzed once with a text, an invitation to some local charity dinner, but she ignored it. Fame had taught her that anonymity was worth more than attention. The jukebox shifted to an older track, the kind her father used to hum when fixing the car. And for a brief moment, the world outside the window blurred into something distant and peaceful. She thought of Los Angeles, of bright lights and cameras, and of how far that life felt now. Here, the world was smaller, more honest. You didn't need headlines to be seen. You only needed a heartbeat and a story worth listening to. The peace began to tilt when the door swung open again, letting in a gust of wet air and laughter. A group of young men stumbled inside wearing partial uniforms, dark trousers, gray shirts with shoulder patches, and boots polished to a dull shine. They were cadets from the nearby military academy. By the look of them, faces still boyish, but already carrying the confidence of men who thought they'd seen everything. Their voices were loud, their jokes louder. They took a table near the dartboard, dragging chairs across the floor, ordering rounds of beer before they'd even sat down. Lena's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd seen this before. Young soldiers in a small-town bar rarely meant anything good after midnight. Rhonda watched them through the reflection in her mug, not out of interest, but awareness. She could tell who the leader was instantly, a tall man with a square jaw, close-cropped hair, and the kind of grin that only came from too much self-assurance. His name, though she didn't know it yet, was Ryan Burke. The others orbited him, laughing too hard at his jokes, echoing his words. He had the energy of someone used to commanding attention, used to being the loudest voice in the room. Rhonda had met men like him in every gym, every press conference, every locker room across the world. Men who mistook volume for strength. They didn't notice her at first, too busy bragging about field training and instructors they'd outsmarted. But then one of them turned toward the bar and froze slightly, squinting. "Hey, isn't that?" he began. Ryan followed his gaze, and when his eyes landed on Rhonda, a slow smile formed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Looks like we've got a celebrity among us tonight." The others turned, murmuring, some pretending to be impressed, others curious. Rhonda didn't react. She lifted her tea to her lips and took a slow sip. But silence only encouraged him. "Ronda Rousey, right? The fighter?" he said, standing up now, like he was addressing a crowd. "Didn't expect to see you here slumming it with us ordinary folk." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Lena shot him a warning glance, but he ignored it. "You still do that cage thing?" he continued. "What's it called, MMA? Must be weird, fighting for money instead of for something real." His friend snickered. Rhonda set her cup down quietly. "I'm just here to drink my tea," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, the kind that carried more weight than shouting ever could. But Ryan wasn't listening. He turned back to his friends performing. "Oh, she's tough," he said mockingly. "Probably gonna choke me out right here if I say the wrong thing." They all laughed, and something in Rhonda's chest tightened. She wasn't angry, not yet, just disappointed. The same kind of disappointment she'd felt countless times before, watching people mistake restraint for weakness. Lena moved closer, her tone sharp. "That's enough, cadet. Sit down." But Ryan only grinned wider. "Relax, ma'am. Just having a little fun. No harm in talking, right?" He raised his glass in a mock toast. "To warriors," he said. "The real kind." A few men at the bar shook their heads, muttering under their breath. The tension spread like static through the room. Rhonda could feel every eye flicking between them now, half expecting her to explode, half hoping she wouldn't. Instead, she leaned back, folded her arms, and met Ryan's gaze for the first time. It wasn't a glare. It was colder than that, steady, assessing, the look of someone measuring distance and danger at once. Ryan's grin faltered for a heartbeat, but pride wouldn't let him back down. He sat again, muttering something under his breath, and the noise of the bar slowly resumed, though the air stayed taut. Rhonda finished her tea, set the empty mug down, and exhaled. She thought briefly about leaving, but something inside told her to stay just a bit longer. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe curiosity. She'd spent her life learning to control fights before they started. But some fights, she'd learned, had a way of finding you no matter how still you tried to stand. Outside, the storm clouds gathered again over the ocean, and thunder rolled far beyond the harbor lights, faint and distant, like a warning too soft to hear. The night at the 7 knots was only just beginning. The storm outside had gathered strength again, brushing the windows of the 7 knots with wet gusts that made the neon lights flicker. Inside, the warmth of the bar remained. But the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter from the cadets' table grew louder, sharper, edged with the kind of arrogance that thrives when alcohol loosens tongues and pride overrides judgment. Lena poured another drink for an old fisherman at the counter, but her eyes kept flicking toward the group. She'd seen it before. Young men in uniforms full of swagger and insecurity, trying to prove something in a world that had yet to test them for real. Rhonda sat where she had been, her hands around the empty mug, eyes half on the window and half on their reflection in the bar's mirror. She wasn't the type to seek conflict, but she knew its smell. It always came before it arrived, like ozone before lightning. Ryan Burke leaned back in his chair, one boot propped on the edge of another seat, spinning his empty beer glass between his fingers. His crew hung on his every word, feeding his ego with laughter. Every so often, his eyes would flick to Ronda's corner. Each time, his grin would widen. "You know," he said to the table, pitching his voice just loud enough for it to carry across the room, "people always talk about UFC fighters like they're these unstoppable warriors. But what is it really? A show, flashing cameras, not like the real thing." The other cadets chuckled. "Try surviving a field exercise with half rations and no sleep for 48 hours. Then we'll talk about toughness." One of the younger cadets, a fresh-faced kid with uncertain eyes, murmured something under his breath, but Ryan ignored him. His voice grew bolder, the alcohol warming his veins. "All that hype about Ronda Rousey," he said, making a lazy gesture toward her corner. "She's famous because people like to see women pretend they can fight. It's entertainment, that's it." The laughter grew again, though now it sounded forced. A few regulars at the bar exchanged looks, uneasy. Nobody liked where this was going, but nobody wanted to be the one to stop it. Ronda didn't move. Her expression didn't change, though a flicker of weariness crossed her face, the kind that comes from hearing the same disrespect too many times. She knew these types, men who hid fear behind loud jokes. She could dismantle them in seconds, but that was never the point. The real challenge was to stay still, to let their noise burn itself out. Lena's voice cut through the tension. "Burke," she said evenly, drying a glass with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who could break it in her hand if she wanted to. "This isn't a training field. Watch your mouth." Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender. "No harm meant, ma'am. Just conversation." He grinned and looked back at Ronda. "Nothing personal, right?" Ronda finally lifted her eyes to him, calm and unreadable. "None taken," she said quietly. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The silence that followed was worse than an insult. It made Ryan feel small, invisible. He couldn't stand it. "See, that's what I mean," he said louder, his grin tightening. "Always acting above it all, like you're made of steel. But I bet in the real world you'd crumble. No referee, no lights, no crowd to save you." His friends laughed again, but their voices were thin now. The youngest one shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lena slammed a bottle on the counter harder than necessary. "That's enough." Ryan turned toward her with that half smile of a man who thought charm could fix anything. "Relax, Lena. We're just teasing. She's a big girl. She can take it." Ronda's gaze slid to him again, then to his reflection in the mirror. Calm, controlled. Her silence only made him angrier. He stood up suddenly, chair scraping the floor. "Come on, you can't be that fragile," he said, walking toward her table, beer still in hand. "I'm just talking. You know, fighter to soldier." He stopped beside her, his shadow falling over the table. Ronda didn't look up. "You're drunk," she said quietly. "Sit down before you embarrass yourself." That stung. His pride flared like a match in gasoline. "Embarrass myself?" he repeated, laughing too loud. "Sweetheart, I don't get embarrassed. I win." He took a slow sip of beer and leaned closer. "You can tell yourself you're a warrior all you want, but deep down, you know the difference between real fighters and people who just play pretend for TV." The words hung heavy in the air. Ronda finally met his eyes, and for a moment, Ryan felt something he hadn't expected. A cold pressure behind his chest, a reminder of the difference between pretending to be dangerous and standing in front of someone who truly was. Her gaze wasn't angry or emotional. It was focused, dissecting him piece by piece, and it made him falter. But pride is louder than fear. He grinned again, pushing the tension forward. "You know what?" he said, stepping back and addressing the room. "Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's the real deal. How about a little friendly test? 3 seconds. I bet I can pin her to the ground before she even blinks." Laughter erupted from his table again, nervous, uncertain. Lena looked ready to intervene, but Ronda lifted a hand slightly. "Don't," she said softly. Then to Ryan, "You should sit down." He shook his head, still smiling, his voice cracking under the pretense of humor. No, I want to see. Come on, champ. Show me what you got." Ronda exhaled through her nose, her patience stretching thin. "This isn't the place," she said, but Ryan wasn't listening. He turned to his friends again, grinning wider. See? I knew it. All talk. Doesn't want to ruin the manicure. A few regulars muttered warnings under their breath, sensing that something irreversible was coming. Even his own group had gone quiet now, except for one who whispered, "Ryan, maybe just leave it." But he didn't. He'd already crossed the line in his mind, and there was no turning back without losing face. "Fine," he said, lifting his glass toward her. "To legends who forgot what real combat feels like." And then he did it, the small, stupid act that would shatter the evening. He tilted the glass forward, spilling the rest of his beer across the table, the amber liquid splashing onto her lap and dripping down the sleeve of her hoodie. Gasps broke out across the room. Someone swore under their breath. The sound of the jukebox died mid-song. Ronda didn't move. She looked down at the spreading puddle, then back up at him. Her voice when she spoke was low and even, but it carried through the silence like a blade through fabric. "You're done?" Ryan laughed, a strained, nervous sound. "Oh, come on, it's just a joke." But she was already rising, slowly, deliberately. Every movement was precise, the kind that made time feel slower. She took a napkin from the table, wiped her sleeve, and dropped it into the wet mess of beer. Then she looked him in the eye. "I was going to take a shower anyway," she said softly, almost kindly. Her calm terrified him more than anger would have. For a heartbeat, he considered backing down. But pride, once again, chose the words for him. "Guess that's one thing you're good at. Running away clean," he muttered. The other cadets laughed again, though no one was really laughing anymore. The storm outside rattled the windows, wind whistling through the cracks like a warning. Inside the 7 knots, the air was dense, charged with something electric and inevitable. Ronda sat back down, her hands folded neatly on the table, as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that bar, including Ryan, knew it wasn't over. The night had taken a turn, and there was no going back. Lena's eyes met Ronda's across the room, a silent question, a warning, and a shared understanding all at once. Ronda's calm nod was the answer. The storm had found its way inside, and soon enough it would break. The tension that had been building inside the 7 knots felt like the air before a lightning strike, dense, silent, waiting for the first crack. The laughter from the cadets' table had grown strained, their amusement feeding on itself, circling the same cruel rhythm. Ryan Burke stood near Ronda's table, still holding what was left of his beer. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. The room had gone too quiet after his last stunt, and that silence made him uneasy. He had to fill it with something sound, laughter, anything that made him feel in control again. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one gathering in that small bar. Ronda sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Her clothes were damp from the spilled beer, but she hadn't moved to wipe them. Every eye in the room was on her now, the whole place caught in that fragile pause between insult and consequence. She could feel Lena watching from behind the counter, jaw tight, towel clenched in her hands. Nobody breathed too loud. The fisherman by the jukebox had stopped mid-conversation. Even the neon hum seemed to dim. Ryan grinned again, but it was a shaky, uncertain grin, the kind that came from nerves masquerading as confidence. "What's the matter, champ?" he said, forcing a laugh. "You gonna write me up for spillage?" He lifted the glass again, swirling the remaining foam. His friends murmured for him to stop, but he didn't hear them or didn't want to. "You said you were going for a shower, right?" he said. "Let me help." Before anyone could stop him, he tipped the glass and poured the rest of it straight over her head. The beer foamed, dripping through her hair, down her neck, over the collar of her hoodie. The room gasped in unison. Someone whispered, "Oh, God!" Lena took a step forward, ready to intervene. But Ronda lifted one hand ever so slightly without looking up, an unspoken command to stay back. For a long moment, she didn't move. The beer continued to drip, forming a small puddle beneath her chair. The laughter that followed came late, brittle and uncertain, as if even the ones laughing weren't sure if they should. Ryan stepped back, emboldened by the sound, waving his hands toward his audience like a performer bowing after a stunt. "See? Harmless fun," he said. "No reason to get all serious. Lighten up." Rhonda finally reached for a napkin and began wiping her face. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She looked like someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. "It's fine," she said, her voice low but perfectly clear. "I was going to shower anyway." She said it without irony, without a hint of mockery, and that calm cut through the noise like a blade. Ryan froze for just a second. The way she said it unnerved him. There was no rage, no shame, only control. He turned toward his friends, forcing another laugh, but it came out hollow. "You hear that? No hard feeling," he said. "Told you she could take a joke." The others nodded weakly, but none of them looked at him. Their eyes stayed on her. There was something in the way she sat now, shoulders squared, jaw set, but her breathing steady, that made everyone in the room instinctively quieter. Even the storm outside seemed to still itself, listening. Lena glanced toward the door as if half expecting someone to walk in and stop this before it went any further. But nobody moved. Rhonda leaned back, letting the cold liquid slide from her hair onto her collar. "You done?" she asked quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a question, simple and final. Ryan heard it but pretended not to. "Sure," he said, lifting his hands. "We're done. You just sit there and meditate or whatever it is you fighters do." He smirked, stepping backward. The room remained frozen around them. Then she smiled, small, controlled, but unmistakably real. "Good," she said, reaching for her empty mug. She set it upright on the table with a faint clink. "Because if you weren't, I'd hate to ruin your night." The smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that made even the air feel sharp. Lena's voice came softly from behind the bar. "Rhonda, let it go." But Rhonda had already let it go. That was the thing. She wasn't going to rise to this. Not yet. "I'm fine," she said, standing. She grabbed her jacket, wringing a bit of moisture from her sleeve. "Thanks, Lena. I think I'll call it a night." The tension began to loosen just slightly. A few people sighed, relieved that the scene might finally be over. Ryan even laughed, shaking his head like it was all just a misunderstanding. "See? No harm, no foul," he said, turning toward his table again. "I told you she wouldn't." He stopped mid-sentence because she hadn't walked toward the door. She was standing right beside him now, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of hops and salt on her clothes. Her voice was so calm that it chilled him. "You know," she said, "you've had just enough to drink to forget what respect looks like. But not enough to forget who's watching." She tilted her head slightly, gesturing toward the mirror behind the bar. Ryan followed her gaze. In the reflection, he could see himself red-faced, drunk, surrounded by an audience that wasn't laughing anymore. For the first time that night, the smug confidence cracked. He swallowed, forcing another laugh. "Hey, it's just a joke. No need to make it serious." But his words landed flat, and he could feel the weight of every eye in the bar pressing on him. Rhonda gave a small nod, as if satisfied with that. "Good," she said. "Then sit down. You've made your point." She turned toward the bar, took a $20 bill from her pocket, and placed it on the counter. "For the mess," she told Lena. "I'll clean up the rest of it later." Lena didn't move. She was watching Ryan, who still hadn't sat down. He was standing rigid, caught between humiliation and defiance, the beer still dripping from the tips of her hair, a reminder of his own stupidity. One of his friends, Eli, the youngest, tugged at his sleeve. "Ryan," he whispered, "let it go, man." But pride never listens to reason. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said suddenly, his voice louder now, the words slurred just enough to sound dangerous. "You think because you're famous, you can come in here and make us look weak?" Rhonda didn't even turn around. "You're doing that on your own," she said, still calm. That quiet reply burned worse than any insult could have. The laughter from his table died completely. No one wanted to side with him anymore. The whole bar had already decided who they respected. He took a step closer, his hand twitching slightly, as though unsure whether he wanted to point or grab. "I'm not afraid of you," he said. She finally looked back at him, her expression soft, almost sympathetic. "I believe you," she said. "That's your problem." And with that, she turned and began walking toward the door, her footsteps steady and deliberate. The rain outside was heavier now, drumming on the roof, echoing through the silence she left behind. Ryan stood there, breath quick and shallow, anger twisting inside him with nowhere to go. Lena watched her go, wiping her hands slowly on the towel. "You're lucky she didn't decide to teach you a lesson," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ryan turned toward her, but the look she gave him made him stop. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of warning and disappointment, that stung worse than any punishment. He sat down heavily, muttering something incoherent, and reached for another drink. The others didn't join him. They stayed silent, staring at the puddle of beer and the door that had just closed behind her. Outside, through the rain-streaked window, Ronda paused beneath the flickering light of the sign. She stood there for a moment, head tilted up, letting the rain mix with the beer in her hair until there was no difference between them. She wasn't angry, not really. She had dealt with worse than a drunk boy with a fragile ego. But she knew it wasn't over. There was a look in his eyes before she left, a look that said he wasn't done proving himself. She exhaled slowly, the mist of her breath catching the glow of the neon. Then she walked away into the rain, calm, collected, every step measured. Behind her, the light above the 7 knots flickered once more, buzzing against the storm like a faint warning that the night had not yet run its course. The storm had eased, but the tension inside the 7 knots lingered like a pressure drop before the next wave. The air smelled of spilled beer, salt, and unease. Ronda's departure had left a vacuum, and everyone felt it, like a clock had stopped ticking mid-second. The cadets still sat in their corner, their laughter gone now, replaced by a strained silence. Ryan Burke hunched over the table, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. His friends tried to distract him with forced jokes, but the energy had drained from the group. Lena continued to clean behind the bar, her movements slower now, more deliberate, watching them without ever truly looking away. She knew that kind of quiet, the kind that preceded something bad. Outside, Ronda had walked into the rain until it began to thin into a mist. She didn't go far, just down the street where the docks opened into the dark water of the bay. The reflection of the neon bar sign shimmered on the puddles, fractured and imperfect. She stood there for a long moment, the night wrapping around her like a wet coat. Anger wasn't what she felt. It was disappointment, a familiar, dull ache she had known for years. She'd spent her life mastering control, learning when to hold back, when to walk away. The hardest thing about strength, she'd once realized, was knowing when not to use it. Tonight had been one of those moments. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of movement through the bar window. Ryan was standing again. Even through the glass, she could tell his stance had changed, rigid, shoulders drawn, frustration written into every line of his body. She sighed quietly, wiped the rain from her forehead, and started back. It wasn't that she wanted another confrontation. She just didn't trust that he wouldn't make one himself. Inside, Ryan was unraveling. The more his friends urged him to forget it, the deeper his resentment grew. He felt humiliated. He could still feel the eyes of everyone in the bar, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. The worst part wasn't what Ronda had said, it was how she hadn't cared. She had looked at him the way you look at a child misbehaving in a grocery store. Tired, patient, unimpressed. That look had done more damage to his pride than any punch could have. "Come on, man, let it go," Eli said, his tone pleading now. "She's gone, it's over." Ryan shook his head. "No," he said quietly, his voice tight. "It's not." He downed the rest of his beer, the glass hitting the table with a sharp clink. The sound cut through the room like a blade. "She thinks she can walk out like that? Like I don't matter?" His words slurred slightly, anger bleeding into every syllable. "She thinks she can humiliate me in front of my unit?" The others exchanged glances. No one answered. There was nothing to say. Lena moved closer, her presence commanding even in silence. "You've had enough," she said simply. "Go home before you do something you'll regret." Ryan's eyes flicked toward her, red with drink and wounded pride. "You think I'm scared of her?" he said. "I've been through worse than some washed-up fighter." Lena didn't flinch. "You don't scare me either," she said, "but you're about to embarrass yourself worse than you already have." The words should have ended it, Instead, they pushed him further. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward, and grabbed his jacket. The sudden movement made a few heads turn, but nobody spoke. They just watched as he stumbled toward the door, the bell above it jangling violently in the quiet. A moment later, the door opened again, and Ronda stepped back inside, water dripping from her sleeves. She paused at the threshold, her gaze sweeping the room. Her eyes found Ryan instantly. It was like they had both known this was where they'd end up. Ryan froze mid-step, caught between leaving and confronting her. For a moment, time stretched thin. Then he laughed, sharp and brittle. "You couldn't just leave it alone, could you?" he said. "Had to come back for a rematch?" His friends tried to intervene, but he shook them off. He moved toward her, each step slower than the last. "What's the matter?" he continued. "You afraid people might think you ran from a fight?" Ronda didn't move. She let him come closer until they were only a few feet apart. Her voice when it came was steady. "You've had enough," she said softly. "Go home, cadet." The way she said cadet carried weight, not as an insult, but as a reminder of discipline, of duty, of who he was supposed to be. It made him flinch just a little. "Don't tell me what to do," he snapped. "You don't give orders here." His voice was trembling now, but his pride wouldn't let him stop. Lena took a step forward. "Ryan," she warned, "that's your last line. Don't cross it." But he already had. He reached out suddenly, grabbing Ronda's arm too hard, too fast, his grip a mix of desperation and rage. The moment his hand touched her, everything in the room shifted. The air itself seemed to tighten. In that instant, she wasn't a customer or a celebrity anymore. She was a fighter, every muscle alive with instinct. Her eyes met his, calm and piercing. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. The words weren't loud, but they carried through the room like thunder. He blinked, confusion flashing across his face, but he didn't let go. "What, you gonna hit me?" he said, forcing a smirk. "In front of everyone? Go ahead. Show us what the big star's made of." Lena knew what was about to happen and braced herself. "Ryan," she said again, but it was already too late. Ronda's movements were precise, almost fluid. She stepped forward, rotating her shoulder just enough to break his grip, then shifted her weight. The motion was so fast that most people didn't even see it happen. One moment Ryan was standing, the next he was on the ground, his back slamming against the wooden floor with a dull thud that silenced the entire bar. His arm twisted behind him, pinned in a lock that made his body seize. He cried out, the sound echoing off the walls, a sharp contrast to the stillness around them. Ronda didn't press harder than necessary. She held the lock just firm enough to stop him from moving, from doing anything stupid. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his face pale and wet with sweat. For the first time that night, his arrogance was gone, stripped away by pain and fear. She leaned closer, her voice calm but unyielding. "This isn't a fight," she said. "This is a lesson." The words seemed to hang there, suspended in the heavy air. She released his arm and stood up slowly. Ryan didn't move. His friends sat frozen, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Nobody clapped. Nobody spoke. They all knew what they had witnessed wasn't anger, it was restraint. Ronda brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, picked up her jacket from where it had fallen, and looked down at him. "Now," she said, her tone even, "we're done." Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The bar stayed silent except for the faint sound of the rain against the windows. Ronda walked to the counter, took a napkin, and wiped the water from her hands. "Sorry about the mess," she said softly. Lena shook her head. "Don't be. You did what you had to." Ronda nodded once, placed another 20 on the counter, and turned toward the door. Ryan slowly sat up, cradling his arm, his face flushed with humiliation. His friends hovered but didn't dare approach him. Lena's voice came from behind the bar, calm but firm. "You should remember this night," she said, "because no one here is going to forget it." Ryan didn't reply. He just stared at the floor, breathing hard, the weight of what had just happened sinking into him. Ronda pushed open the door. The cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and the quiet that follows thunder. She stepped out into the night, pulling her hood up. Behind her, the door closed with a soft click, leaving the bar in stunned silence. Outside, the storm had passed, but the world still smelled of electricity and change. As she walked down the empty street, her footsteps echoed against the wet pavement, steady and unhurried. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been given. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain and wood smoke as Rhonda stepped out into the street. Behind her, the 7 knots glowed dimly through its fogged windows, the noise inside reduced to a stunned quiet. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The rhythm of her pulse had already slowed, her breathing steady, calm. Every step she took away from that place felt lighter, but her mind remained sharp, focused not from anger, but from the clarity that followed it. She'd spent years training her body to react only when it must, to move not from rage but from instinct and control. Tonight had been no different. She hadn't planned to teach anyone anything, yet lessons had a way of righting themselves when arrogance went unchecked. Inside the bar, Ryan still sat on the floor, his back against the leg of a stool, one hand gripping his sore arm. He couldn't quite bring himself to look at anyone. The pain wasn't just in his shoulder, it was in his pride, a deeper ache that no bandage could fix. The others watched him cautiously, unsure whether to speak. The air was thick with shame, and even those who'd laughed earlier now found it hard to meet each other's eyes. They had seen something that stripped away the illusion of toughness they had been building around themselves. In one brief, fluid moment, Rhonda had reminded everyone in that room what real discipline looked like. Lena poured herself a small glass of whiskey and leaned on the counter, studying Ryan. "You should probably get that looked at," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't mocking. It was weary, maternal, like she'd seen too many young men walk down the same road. He didn't respond. He just stared at the puddle of beer still glistening on the floor where she had stood, as if it held some secret he couldn't decipher. "You know," Lena went on, "you're not the first to come in here thinking you're bulletproof, but the smart ones learn before they bleed." She took a slow sip and set the glass down with a soft clink. "You got off easy tonight." Ryan's jaw clenched. "She humiliated me," he said, voice low and hoarse, "in front of everyone." Lena shook her head. "No, son, you did that all by yourself." Outside, the rain had turned into a fine mist, drifting across the harbor like smoke. Rhonda walked along the wooden boardwalk, the faint creak of the planks under her boots blending with the distant sound of waves. The anger that had briefly flickered in her chest was gone now, replaced by a quiet sadness. She didn't enjoy what she'd done. She never did. Violence was never satisfying. It was simply a language, one she'd learned to speak fluently when words failed. Tonight it had been necessary, but it still left that familiar hollow space inside her, the one that reminded her how easily strength could be mistaken for cruelty. She reached the end of the dock and leaned on the railing, watching the reflection of the streetlights shimmer across the water. The ocean was calm now, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of passing fish or a drifting branch. The quiet wrapped around her like a blanket. For a while she simply stood there, letting the cool air wash over her, rinsing away the remnants of adrenaline. Her reflection in the dark water looked almost like a stranger's, strong, still, but tired. Back in the bar, the silence was slowly cracking. The cadets spoke in hushed tones now, voices stripped of bravado. "She didn't even look angry," Eli murmured. It was like she already knew how it was going to end. One of the others nodded. "She didn't hit him. Didn't need to." They felt quiet again, the truth of it sinking in. Rhonda hadn't fought him. She'd controlled him. There was a difference, and they all felt it now. Ryan stood up finally, his movements stiff. His friends reached out to help, but he shook them off. He wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating weight of that room, but he couldn't bring himself to move just yet. Something in him resisted the idea of walking away beaten. Pride and shame twisted together, a poison that burned more the longer it sat. He looked toward the door, where Rhonda had vanished into the night, and felt something foreign, a flicker of respect buried beneath the bruised ego. He wouldn't admit it aloud, not tonight, maybe not ever, but part of him understood that she hadn't hurt him out of anger. She'd done it because he'd forced her to, because some lines once crossed needed to be redrawn. Lena watched him a moment longer, then turned back to cleaning. You know, she said, not looking at him, you could do worse than learning from that woman. The way she handled you, calm, efficient, without hatred, that's what strength looks like. Not fists. Control. She poured another glass, this time sliding it toward him. Drink it, then go home. Ryan hesitated, then took it. The whiskey burned going down, but it steadied him somehow. He muttered a quiet thanks that she didn't acknowledge, and a few minutes later, he finally left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The night air slapped his face, cold and sharp. The streets were almost empty, the rain now little more than a whisper on the rooftops. He walked aimlessly at first, replaying the scene in his head, the sound of his body hitting the floor, the stunned faces of his friends, the calm in her voice when she said, "This isn't a fight, this is a lesson." He hated how those words kept echoing, how they rang with truth. He found himself down by the docks without meaning to, drawn by the same instinct that had pulled her there earlier. She was still there, leaning against the railing, her hood up, her posture relaxed. For a moment, he just watched her. The anger that had driven him earlier was gone, replaced by something humbler. She turned her head slightly, sensing his presence before he spoke. "Didn't think you'd follow me," she said, her tone neutral. "I just wanted to say—" He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. "You didn't have to do that." She turned fully now, her eyes catching the faint reflection of the dock lights. "Yes, I did," she said softly. "Because you weren't listening." He looked away, embarrassed. "I guess I deserved it." She didn't answer right away. "Deserves a strange word," she said. "You wanted to test someone, and you did. You just didn't like the result." He managed a small, rueful smile. "You don't pull punches, do you?" "I didn't hit you," she replied simply. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's the part that hurts most." She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the water. "You're not a bad kid, just loud. Maybe stop confusing volume with strength." He nodded, the lesson landing heavier than he expected. "I'll work on that." "Good," she said, pushing away from the railing. "Then tonight wasn't wasted." She walked past him then, her footsteps echoing softly against the wood. He watched her go, still feeling the sting in his shoulder, but strangely lighter inside. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the night wash clean. When he returned to the bar, Lena had already wiped the counters and dimmed the lights. She looked up as he entered, her gaze soft but firm. "You talked to her?" He nodded. "Yeah." "Then maybe you learned something after all." He didn't argue. He just sat at the empty counter for a while, the weight of the evening settling like dust. Outside, the water lapped gently against the docks, and in the faint glow of the neon sign, the world felt a little quieter, a little wiser. By morning, the storm had moved out to sea, leaving the town washed clean and strangely quiet. The streets still glistened from the night's rain, the air thick with the scent of salt and wet asphalt. The Seven Knots opened its doors early, as it always did on Sundays. Fishermen came for coffee before heading to their boats, the usual murmur of small talk returning to the walls that had held so much tension the night before. The floorboards had been mopped, the broken glass swept up, and yet something intangible lingered in the air, a hush that spoke of change. Rhonda sat alone at a small table near the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She'd slept little, not because of unrest, but because her mind was still turning over the events of the night before. She had done what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less. But even necessary things could leave a mark. Across from her, the empty chair reflected the silence she carried. She didn't regret her restraint, but she regretted that it had been needed at all. She'd spent a lifetime surrounded by fighters people who believed that every insult demanded retaliation. It had taken her years to learn that real power was in what you chose not to do. Lena was behind the counter, pretending to polish glasses, though she kept glancing at Rhonda now and then. Finally, she came over, drying her hands on a towel. "You planning to make this place a habit?" she asked with a faint smile. Rhonda looked up. "Maybe. Depends on whether your customers plan to pour anything on me again." Lena chuckled softly. "I think last night cured them of that." She sat across from her, lowering her voice. "Ryan came back this morning, before we opened." Rhonda raised an eyebrow. "Brave of him. He wasn't the same kid, Lena said. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but you know what I mean. He said he wanted to thank you. Said he learned something. Rhonda took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle. Then maybe it was worth it. Lena leaned back, crossing her arms. You know, I've been running this place 20 years. I've seen all kinds walk through that door, angry, broken, loud, scared. But last night was the first time I saw someone get humbled without being destroyed. You did that? Rhonda smiled faintly. He humbled himself. I just helped him see where the edge was. Lena nodded. Still, it's rare these days. Everyone wants to win. Nobody wants to learn. The door opened, letting in a rush of cool morning air. Ryan stepped inside, his uniform pressed, his posture careful. His friends were nowhere in sight. He spotted Rhonda immediately, hesitated only a moment, then walked over. Lena stood, giving him space, but stayed close enough in case things went sideways. He stopped by the table. Morning, he said quietly. Rhonda looked up at him, studying his face. The cocky grin was gone. The arrogance, too. What replaced it was something unfamiliar but genuine respect. Morning, she said. He cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize for everything. What I said, what I did. She nodded once. I know. He blinked, unsure how to respond to that. I mean it, he added. I was out of line. I thought I had something to prove, but I was just being stupid. Rhonda gestured to the seat across from her. Sit down. He did. The two sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the harbor drifting through the open door, the cry of gulls, the distant clatter of fishing gear, the hum of an engine starting. Finally, she said, You know what your problem is, Ryan? He gave a nervous half smile. I'm guessing you'll tell me anyway. You think strength is something you show people, she said. It's not. Real strength is quiet. It's what you hold back, not what you throw around. He nodded slowly. I learned that the hard way. Good, she said. Hard lessons stick. He exhaled, looking down at his hands. My CO heard about what happened. Thought I got into another bar fight. I told him I got taught one instead. Rhonda couldn't help but smile. Maybe he'll buy that. He laughed, Ryan said. Said maybe I should thank whoever gave it to me. You just did, she replied. He stood, straightening his jacket. Still, for what it's worth, I deserved worse. She shook her head. No, you got exactly what you needed. He hesitated before leaving. You ever think about teaching again? Every day, she said softly, but some lessons come to you instead of the other way around. He smiled, nodded once, and left, the doorbell jingling behind him. Lena returned with 2 refills and set one down in front of Rhonda. You're something else, she said. You didn't just shut him down, you fixed him. I didn't fix anyone, Rhonda said. He'll either remember what he learned or forget it the next time someone laughs at him. That part's not up to me. Lena smirked. Still, I'd say he's not the kind who forgets. Outside, Ryan walked toward the docks, the wind off the water lifting his hair. He felt lighter somehow, as if he'd shed a version of himself he didn't realize he'd been carrying. He thought of what she'd said about real strength being quiet. It stayed with him as he watched the fishermen hauling nets, men who worked without applause, who built their worth in silence. Back inside, Rhonda watched the morning light cut through the haze and spill across the bar. She'd come in the night before for nothing more than a drink and anonymity. Instead, she'd found herself reminding someone, and maybe herself, what restraint really meant. The world didn't need more people who could fight. It needed more people who knew when not to. She stood, left a few bills on the table, and thanked Lena before stepping out into the crisp air. The storm had scrubbed the town clean, the sky now a soft blue streaked with the last remnants of cloud. She pulled her hood up and began to walk. The sun had broken through, glinting off the puddles in the street. Each step echoed with calm finality, the kind that comes only after a night where something shifts inside you, something small, but enough to change how the world feels when the light returns. For the first time in a long while, Rhonda felt peace. The world was quiet again, and so was she. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. And make sure to check out our next episodes and more stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next.